Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack the sources you share with us to find those essential nuggets of knowledge.
Today, we're taking on a topic that often feels overwhelming, even paralyzing: climate change.
Yeah, the narrative, the urgency, the impending doom, the call to save the planet. It's pervasive.
It truly is. We're
Yeah.
constantly bombarded with messages that push for immediate, drastic action, creating this sense of emergency that's hard to ignore.
Exactly. But what if that widely accepted idea, that overwhelming sense of climate emergency, has actually maybe led us astray?
Hmm.
What if it's hindered rather than helped us find truly effective and just solutions?
Well, that's the core question Raoul Sanchez tackles in his book, The Climate Panic.
Right. And today we're diving into that. His book invites us to really question our current approach to environmental issues.
What's truly fascinating here is Sanchez's core argument that this prevailing climate emergency narrative, while often well-intentioned, has paradoxically led to haste, oversimplification, and a dangerous polarization of the debate.
And he comes at it from an interesting angle, right? A computer engineer.
Yeah, which gives him a unique lens on systems, on complexity, and societal transformation.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack that whole idea. We'll explore why he calls for, lucidity, intellectual rigor, open debate.
hmm And a deep engagement with complexity and local realities, things that often get lost in the noise.
Consider this deep dive your shortcut to understanding the nuances of the climate discourse. Hopefully it helps you navigate the information overload.
And maybe identify areas for deeper, more informed thinking on your own.
Yeah, I think you'll be surprised by some of the underlying dynamics Sanchez points out.
Definitely.
So let's go back to the origins of this climate panic, as Sanchez describes it. He points back to the 70s, right? A foundational shift.
Exactly. For the first time, people really began to understand Earth not just as, an endless resource,
Right.
but as a complex global system with actual physical limits.
That's where models like the Limits to Growth came in, Club of Rome, MIT.
That's right, they were pivotal. Using computer simulations to show how continuous growth in a finite world could, potentially lead to collapse.
But the key insight then wasn't panic.
No, Sanchez argues it was more a call for clarity about understanding these incredibly complex interconnected systems, how disturbing them could have big consequences. It was about understanding, not sheer panic.
So how did we get from that kind of nuanced systemic understanding to slogans like save the planet?
It seems it happened gradually. He suggests media coverage, the pressure of political timelines. They started eroding that initial complexity.
Right, so systemic thinking gets pushed aside.
Yeah, replaced by these urgency-driven narratives. And those simplified slogans, they're emotionally impactful, sure, but they lack that analytical rigor, that deep system understanding.
Okay, and then the IPCC comes along in '88, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A lot of people think they do original research, but Sanchez clarifies their role is different.
Yeah, it's more like a vast filtering mechanism. They summarize existing research from, thousands of papers.
To inform political decisions.
Exactly. And this filtering process is crucial to understand. The IPCC aims for consensus to inform policy.
Which sounds good, but
But it means simplifying complex realities. It means often smoothing over controversies and uncertainties to create what Sanchez calls a stabilized version of knowledge for, diplomatic imperatives.
so the summary for policymakers is actually a political text.
Very much so. It's negotiated line by government delegates. It's not a pure scientific abstract.
And this process can sideline other types of knowledge, local, indigenous.
Right. It tends to prioritize Western scientific publications and often narrows the focus down to a few key indicators, like the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, which can limit how we even imagine the future.
Okay, so if the science is building consensus, why did the public discourse turn into what Sanchez calls a climate spectacle?
Well, the 1990s saw this major shift. Climate issues started getting way more media attention, and scientific language started giving way to more emotional communication. Catchy phrases, powerful images.
Ah, the images, the polar bear on the ice floe, the wildfires.
Exactly. Powerful, often decontextualized images designed to grab attention, often driven by fear. International conferences became these media showcases.
And Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. That was a huge moment.
Oh, absolutely. It massively raised public awareness, no doubt. But it also faced criticism, even at the time, for some oversimplifications. And what's more, Sanchez notes, it blurred the line between activism and self-interest, given Gore's significant climate-related business ventures.
Right. And then social media just pours gasoline on that fire.
Totally. Algorithms tend to favor emotional, often alarmist content. It leads to polarization. You see the rise of non-expert spokespersons.
Where visibility trumps actual expertise.
Precisely. A sensational post just gets way more traction than a sober, nuanced report.
Which sounds a lot like what Sanchez calls the strategic use of urgency.
That's it exactly. The climate emergency frame has become a really useful instrument.
Useful for whom?
Well, useful to legitimize rapid decisions. Maybe push through societal transformations faster, justify unpopular measures.
Ulrich Beck talked about society as governing by threat, right?
Yeah, back in the 90s, this sense of urgency narrows the options, it restricts long-term thinking, and it can allow certain solutions to be pushed through without maybe full evaluation.
And you see this in government declarations of emergency, UK, Spain, Canada.
Often, yeah. Sanchez points out they can be largely symbolic, lacking concrete, measurable actions to back them up.
And the private sector jumps on this too.
You sure? Using urgency to justify huge investment in specific technologies, like EVs, for example, sometimes without fully assessing all the implications. And this emotional framing polarizes academic and activist circles, too.
So it's not just about raising awareness, it's really about constructing a dominant narrative.
That's his argument. The discourse is narrowed into this structured, globalized narrative. It prioritizes specific causes, like human GHG emissions.
Specific responses, like CO2 reduction.
Right, and this unified vision of a planet under threat that needs centralized action, which is powerful, but...
But it sidelines other ways of thinking,
Yeah.
like decolonial perspectives, feminist ecology, indigenous knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it tends to favor technological solutionism, think carbon neutrality, over maybe more systemic ideas like degrowth.
And it sets up a hierarchy, Western institutions at the top.
Often, yes. And even environmental education can sometimes present climate issues as these settled facts, which, ironically, might weaken critical thinking skills.
Okay, so let's summarize this first part. The big takeaway is that this shift from a nuanced systemic understanding in the 70s towards a simplified, urgency-driven narrative kind of fueled by media politics, financial interests,
Right.
has really shaped our current, often quite rigid approach to climate action. And the risk is it limits diverse voices, limits critical thought, and maybe pushes us towards solutions that aren't actually the most effective or just.
That's a good summary of his starting point.
Okay, so moving beyond the discourse itself, let's talk about the human cost. Sanchez spends a lot of time on the psychological impacts of this emergency framing. Eco-anxiety, for instance.
Yeah, and it's not just a buzzword. It's a tangible psychological reality, especially studies show among younger generations.
What does it feel like? Fear, sadness?
All of that, fear, sadness, anger, helplessness, it's impacting daily lives. But Sanchez's crucial insight is that this anxiety isn't just a personal reaction to, say, a wildfire nearby.
It's more systemic.
It's a product of this collective narrative. Sustained by the constant catastrophic imagery, the simplified messages about tipping points and deadlines, it's often the framing of reality, the way it's communicated, that fuels the anxiety as much as the reality itself.
And this can lead to psychological defenses, tuning out.
Yeah, or becoming really rigid in your activism, maybe unable to hear other perspectives. Basically, our minds try to cope with information that feels overwhelming.
Which brings us to emotional overload. What does that look like in practice?
Well, think about weather reports. Remember when summer heat was just yellow or orange? Now it's often bright red, even for temperatures that weren't considered extreme before.
That's the aesthetic of urgency he talks about.
Exactly. It shapes your emotional perception, maybe more than the objective data sometimes. And this constant overload can be paralyzing. It leads to weariness, helplessness, or sometimes overreaction.
It's not just young people feeling this, presumably.
No, not at all. Parents feel intense anxiety too, projecting fears onto their children's future. Too much alarming information, especially if it's poorly articulated or lacks solutions, can just lead to withdrawal, disengagement, or even radicalization at the other extreme.
And this can go deeper than anxiety, right? Affecting people's sense of meaning.
It absolutely can. Prolonged exposure to these bleak climate visions, it can cause a quieter, but maybe more profound disturbance. It erodes your sense of meaning, impacts fundamental life choices.
Like people deciding not to have children because of climate change.
That's a stark example, yes. People feel caught in what Sanchez, citing others, calls moral dissonance or ethical fatigue. There's also solastalgia.
Solastalgia?
Yeah, it's like a distress over environmental degradation, even when you're not directly impacted. a kind of homesickness for a home environment that's changing before your eyes.
Wow. An unacknowledged ecological grief.
Right. A slow, diffuse sense of collapse, often experienced in solitude. It can lead to emotional withdrawal, apathy. It's heavy stuff.
It sounds incredibly burdensome, and it links directly to the problem with guilt-inducing narratives, doesn't it?
It really does. Environmental awareness has become so tightly coupled with this moralizing discourse.
Hmm.
It focuses heavily on individual responsibility. Consume less, recycle more, track your carbon footprint.
Which isn't necessarily bad in itself, but
But it creates what Sanchez calls a burdensome normative climate. It often overlooks the huge role of systemic issues and social inequalities. It can lead to self-blame, especially for people who just can't afford the greener options, while overshadowing the much larger structural causes.
so does guilt actually work as a motivator for change?
Well, the effects are ambivalent, Sanchez suggests. You see some radical activist actions like, just stop oil protests.
Throwing soup at paintings.
Right. Which definitely reflect an acute psychological tension. But studies are mixed. Sometimes those actions reduce broader public support.
Though other research suggests a radical flank effect, making moderate groups seem more reasonable.
Exactly. So it's complex. But the key insight is that relying primarily on guilt is probably a risky strategy if you want sustained collective action built on more than just feeling bad.
All of this seems to point towards needing to, well, learn to live with uncertainty.
Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
a core psychological skill, Sanchez emphasizes. Environmental dynamics are complex. The future isn't fully predictable, despite the models.
So we need to tolerate uncertainty.
Develop a tolerance for it, yes. Learn to inhabit that discomfort rather than trying to eliminate it with, say, overly confident predictions or simple solutions.
Are there ways to do that?
Yes. Approaches like Joanna Macy's work that reconnects are mentioned. They help people acknowledge the pain, the grief, the fear, but constructively, leading to clear-sighted engagement rather than paralysis.
And education plays a role.
A huge role. Educational therapeutic approaches are emerging, particularly in places like Scandinavia. They focus on fostering critical thinking, reconnecting individuals with an uncertain world, but without offering sort of artificial reassurance.
Okay, so the core message from this part is that the psychological impacts of the dominant climate narrative are real and they're a critical side effect.
They can foster anxiety, sure, but also disengagement or polarization.
So a more meaningful approach needs more nuanced communication, space for reflection, not just amplifying fear or individual guilt.
Precisely. It's about finding a balance that empowers action without psychologically overwhelming people.
Okay, this connects directly to another major theme in Sanchez's work, the way dissent gets silenced and the urgent need for, well, pluralism in the climate debate.
Yes, this is a really critical part of his analysis. He argues that while the scientific consensus on climate change itself is robust,
Right, that's not really in question here.
no, but the affirmation of that consensus has, maybe paradoxically, narrowed the space for debate about the implications, the solutions, the uncertainties.
Oh, so.
What began as a shared scientific foundation has sometimes shifted into a kind of disciplinary norm. Contradiction, or even just nuance, can get perceived not as complexity to explore, but as denial to be dismissed.
Even within the scientific process itself, like
Yeah.
the IPCC.
He suggests that the drive for consensus within the IPCC process, while necessary for its political role, might inadvertently smooth over unconventional hypotheses or critical approaches to achieve that unified message for policymakers. Thinkers like Judith Curry or Mike Holm have raised similar points.
And what about that 97% consensus statistic? We hear that all the time.
Sanchez views it as potentially problematic in the public sphere. While factually based on specific studies, it often gets wielded as an argument of authority.
To shut down debate.
It can
Right.
have that effect, yeah. Polarizing the discussion rather than fostering a nuanced understanding of where the consensus lies and where legitimate scientific or societal debate still exists. It can also push critical perspectives from the social sciences or humanities to the margins.
Which leads to this shift from critique to outright disqualification.
That's the danger he points to. The term climate skeptic, which originally referred to those denying the basic science of warming,
Right.
has been broadened sometimes to disqualify almost any position that doesn't fully align with the dominant narrative on causes, impacts, and solutions. This creates an atmosphere of suspicion around nuance itself.
I can see how that would lead to self-censorship. people being afraid to speak up.
Definitely. Sanchez cites research indicating self-censorship in professional settings, where people might avoid certain topics for fear of being wrongly associated with denialist currents,
And online, too.
especially online. On platforms like X, TikTok, YouTube, the algorithms often favor messages with a very firm moral stance. They show little tolerance for ambiguity or contradiction.
It's a kind of silent sorting.
That's a good way to put it. Opaque algorithms amplify the dominant or emotionally charged narratives. This isn't necessarily censorship in the traditional sense, but it inadvertently reduces the visibility of diverse viewpoints, even methodologically sound critical perspectives, if they don't fit the mold. Efforts to combat disinformation can sometimes sweep up legitimate critique, too.
So doubt itself, which is fundamental to critical thinking in science, starts to be seen as a threat to unity.
That's the core problem he identifies. In the climate sphere, doubt is increasingly regarded with moral suspicion. We see reports about declining academic freedom, increased self-censorship, even on climate topics in universities.
Even within activist groups.
Yeah, internal critiques can sometimes be framed as divisive, as undermining the cause. But Sanchez argues, drawing on others, that refusing these tensions, these internal disagreements, actually deprives collectives of their capacity to learn and evolve.
So restoring a legitimate place for doubt, for questioning, is essential.
Essential for building engagement that's grounded in critical inquiry, not just conformity or fear.
Which means we need to move towards what Sanchez calls a responsible pluralism.
Exactly. The vitality of knowledge, he argues, depends on integrating contradiction, embracing uncertainty. This doesn't mean giving equal platform to outright denial or manipulation,
No, of course not.
but it does mean actively distinguishing well-founded critique, methodological questions, or debates about values and solutions from manipulative posturing.
Are there examples of this happening?
Yes, he mentions initiatives like the Oxford Climate Dialogues, which aim to bring different perspectives into conversation, exposing those epistemic and cultural tensions constructively. There's a growing call to reintegrate social sciences, humanities, and situated local knowledge into the broader field of climate expertise.
And our communication needs to change, too, not smoothing things over.
Right. Holding ambiguity, acknowledging dilemmas, making the trade-offs explicit. This makes collective action more conscious of its own assumptions, more resilient.
Okay, so the big takeaway here is crucial. True, effective climate action needs more debate, not less. Not an imposed unanimity, but a dynamic, open discussion that embraces complexity, diversity, and reasoned disagreement.
That's what strengthens its legitimacy, its adaptability, its chance of actually working in a complex, uncertain world.
This whole discussion about narratives, consensus, and who gets heard leads us straight into another critical area Sanchez explores. Who actually benefits from the current energy transition? He argues it's often designed by and for a privileged few.
That's a really powerful and often uncomfortable insight he brings forward. Energy transition policies, think subsidies for solar panels, tax credits for electric vehicles, are very often designed within quite narrow institutional circles.
By people from similar backgrounds.
Often, yes, actors from economically and culturally privileged backgrounds. And this inevitably leads to policies that align better with the living standards and capabilities of a minority.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. He cites data showing strong correlations between high income and the adoption of things like residential solar panels, or EVs, in countries like Germany, the UK, the US.
I think I read somewhere that in the U.S., something like 70% of residential solar went to households earning over $100,000.
Figures like that are common. We see similar patterns in Switzerland and France. This imbalance reinforces the transition as almost a marker of social distinction, a lifestyle choice for the affluent.
Which undermines its legitimacy for everyone else.
Exactly. It can fuel distrust among working-class populations or people in rural areas who often feel excluded from the decision-making and unable to participate in the benefits. They might not be contesting the ecological goal itself.
How it's being done.
Precisely. How it's imposed, often top-down, detached from their practical constraints and realities.
And this leads to what Sanchez calls the invisible social cost.
Right. There's a paradox here. The transition aims for a fairer future, theoretically, but in practice, it often places significant burdens on the most vulnerable groups.
How so?
Rising energy prices, maybe higher housing costs due to new standards, technical requirements that are simply inaccessible. Think about the French Yellow Vest movement in 2018.
Triggered by a carbon tax, right?
Exactly. It was a key example of widespread rejection of what felt like a top-down, socially unjust approach to climate policy, even if the environmental aim was sound.
So people most exposed to climate impacts might also bear the biggest burden of the adjustments without getting the benefits.
That's the ecological double penalty he describes. Think about subsidies for home renovations. They often require significant upfront investment or navigating complex paperwork. This effectively excludes many low-income households.
And what about marginalized territories? Rural areas, peripheral regions.
They're often overlooked. The dominant transition narrative gets shaped in urban centers. It often neglects the very different realities of rural life. Different housing stock, different mobility needs, different economic basis.
So decarbonization plans, assuming dense urban public transport, don't really work there.
Not easily. Or policies promoting heat pumps might be totally impractical in old, poorly insulated rural homes, maybe due to grid limitations or just the sheer cost. Accessing support is often administratively complex too.
And there's a symbolic invisibility as well. Urban low-carbon lifestyles presented as the universal ideal.
Precisely. It feels a sense of exclusion, a feeling that these policies aren't designed for them.
And this naturally leads to local resistance against wind farms, low-emission zones.
Understandably so. Sanchez emphasizes that this opposition often isn't a rejection of the transition itself, but a critique of how it's being designed and imposed. Lack of consultation, concentration of profits elsewhere, destruction of local landscapes.
We see examples everywhere: France, Switzerland.
Yeah, protests against wind farms on the Millevaches Plateau in France, or Mont Soleil in Switzerland. Internationally, you see resistance to huge solar farms displacing communities in China, or indigenous opposition to green grabbing for renewable projects in places like Peru.
But it doesn't have to be this way. There are successful local models.
Absolutely. He points to German energy cooperatives or Amsterdam's participatory approach to its climate strategy. These models ensure fairer distribution of benefits and costs and strong local involvement. It proves that social acceptability hinges much more on the method of implementation, the process, than just the content or the goal.
So Sanchez is calling for us to take inequalities seriously from the start. Rethink policies using justice criteria.
Explicit criteria, yes.
Yep.
He draws on thinkers like Nancy Fraser and David Schlossberg, talking about distributive justice, who pays, who benefits, procedural justice, who gets to decide, and recognition justice, whose experiences and values are actually seen and respected.
Can you give examples of that in action?
Things like targeted financial support for low-income households in French low-emission zones, shared governance models for energy projects in the Netherlands, genuine co-development processes with local communities in places like Montreal or Glasgow.
And Barcelona's Superblocks program.
That's a great example of spatial justice, he notes. Prioritizing interventions like reducing traffic and creating green space in disadvantaged neighborhoods first.
Okay, so the crucial insight here is that if the ecological transition isn't designed with a deep, upfront commitment to justice, social, territorial, procedural thing, it risks just deepening the divides we already have.
Exactly. And acknowledging these inequalities isn't just morally right. Sanchez argues it's fundamental to the transition's legitimacy and, ultimately, its effectiveness.
Digging even deeper now, Sanchez really peels back the layers to look at the powerful interests behind the emergency framework. He talks about the surprising rise of climate finance. What does he mean by that?
It's a really critical point. The whole effort to combat climate disruption has, over time, evolved into a pretty structured economic model in itself.
You mean like carbon markets?
Carbon markets are a prime example. Set up under agreements like Kyoto and Paris, they allow the buying and selling of emission rights. Theoretically, this is meant to achieve mitigation efficiently.
But there's a dark side.
Sanchez definitely highlights one. These markets can enable a whole sphere of financial speculation. Issues like fictitious carbon credits, credits that don't represent real emission reductions, have emerged. Profit-driven financial actors get involved, and offsetting can become, as he puts it, more of a display strategy for corporations than genuine action.
Yeah, we're talking huge sums of money flowing into this space.
Massive amounts. Huge public and private investments are pouring into transition technologies, batteries, green hydrogen, carbon capture.
But it's concentrated.
Very much so. He cites IEA data showing nearly 70% of global energy transition investment recently went to just 10 countries, mostly industrialized nations. And specialized financial instruments tend to favor large-scale, high-return projects.
Sidelining smaller, local solutions.
Often, yes. Community-based projects might struggle to attract that kind of finance. This leads to another key point. Public support often translates into private gains.
How does that work?
The energy transition relies heavily on public incentives, subsidies, tax credits. While these definitely accelerate growth in renewables, and other areas,
Which is the goal.
which is the goal, yes. But they often lead to a concentration of benefits and what economists call windfall effects.
Can you give an example of those windfall effects?
Sure. Tens of billions in public funds have gone to support major corporations setting up battery factories. For instance, companies like Northvolt, Stellantis, VW. Meanwhile, smaller businesses often face significant barriers to accessing that kind of support.
Or early solar programs.
Right. He mentions early solar feed-in tariff programs in places like Spain and Italy around the early 2010s, where financial investors, rather than homeowners or communities, captured a large chunk of the public funds. Tax schemes designed to encourage green investments also tend to primarily benefit more affluent households who can afford the initial outlay.
So climate policy needs to be distribution policy too.
Sanchez argues it must be. He does note some positive examples starting to emerge, like in Canada or Scotland, where policies are trying to build in redistributive criteria to address these disparities.
Okay, and then there's the issue we hear so much about, institutional greenwashing.
Yeah, and Sanchez argues it's pervasive. It's become a common strategy where corporations use ecological language, sustainability reports, eco-labels, primarily for image management, but without making fundamental structural changes to their business models.
Relying on unverifiable reports, self-awarded labels, vague long-term pledges.
All of the above. He cites a New Climate Institute report showing many major companies' carbon neutrality pledges were overstated or lacked substance. Even governments aren't immune. Look at the controversy when the EU revised its green taxonomy to include natural gas and nuclear power under certain conditions.
Which erodes public trust.
Massively. It dilutes critical terms like sustainable or carbon neutral. That's why robust, independent evaluation tools, like the Corporate Climate Responsibility Monitor he mentions, are so important.
Beyond corporations, climate has also become a geopolitical lever.
Absolutely. The fight against climate change is now a major strategic issue in international diplomacy. Big powers, the EU, China, the U.S., use climate discourse and policy to advance their own economic and political agendas.
And countries in the global south, often the most vulnerable.
They often struggle to shape global priorities. Financial commitments made by richer countries are frequently tied to the donor's own interests or priorities, and dominant concepts like green growth can sometimes marginalize indigenous knowledge or community-based alternatives that don't fit the mold.
So Sanchez calls for what he terms structural vigilance. What does that mean?
It means actively recognizing the potential for manipulation and conflicting interests within the climate domain, understanding that noble goals can sometimes mask underlying economic, industrial, or political logics that might actually run counter to effective or just climate action.
Are there tools for this?
Yes. Things like Influence Map or the Climate Transparency Report exist to monitor corporate climate stances and expose the gap between pledges and actual performance. But this vigilance, Sanchez stresses, must also apply to the narratives themselves. We need to be wary of strategic optimism that papers over the need for fundamental transformations.
Okay, so the big takeaway here is really stark. Behind the often noble goals of climate action, there are complex economic and political mechanisms at play.
Mechanisms that profoundly shape who benefits, who participates, and who gets left behind.
So a credible transition requires independent oversight, much more transparency, and a clear-eyed acknowledgement of these conflicting interests and power struggle.
Without that vigilance, we risk pursuing pathways that aren't truly sustainable or equitable.
Whenever these discussions happen, technology often gets presented as the ultimate answer, the silver bullet. But Sanchez really challenges this, asking if technology is sometimes becoming an alibi for inaction on deeper issues.
That's a really central and provocative part of his argument. He suggests that governments and corporations often turn to technological solutions. Electric vehicles, green hydrogen, carbon capture, partly because they seem to offer a way forward without fundamentally challenging existing lifestyles or dominant economic models.
So it preserves system stability, avoids harder questions.
That's the concern. It can divert attention and, crucially, resources away from addressing deeper causes like overconsumption patterns or the extractivist nature of our economy. And these tech solutions often concentrate power and wealth among large corporations in certain states.
Like China's dominance in solar panel manufacturing or the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act favoring large firms.
Exactly. And we also have to consider the gray footprint of these supposedly green technologies.
What do you mean by gray footprint?
Well, they rely heavily on extracting critical resources, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, often from ecologically fragile regions, with significant social and environmental costs. And they can have rebound effects. Electric vehicles are a good example. They might reduce tailpipe emissions, but they don't solve traffic congestion or the resource demands of making cars.
And what about the really big controversial stuff, geoengineering?
Sanchez raises serious concerns here. Techniques like solar radiation management, basically trying to dim the sun, or large-scale carbon dioxide removal, are gaining visibility and funding. But they come with huge question marks.
Carbon capture, for instance, like those big fans sucking CO2 out of the air.
Yeah, projects like Climeworks in Iceland. He points out it's currently incredibly expensive, maybe around 275 euros per ton of CO2, and very energy intensive. Capturing 1 ton might use as much energy as an average European household consumes in a month.
Wow. And solar radiation management, injecting particles into the stratosphere.
That raises even bigger alarms.
Yeah.
Scientists warn about potentially catastrophic systemic risks, disrupting monsoon patterns, accelerating ocean acidification, creating new geopolitical tensions over who controls the Earth thermostat. Projects like Harvard's ScopeX were suspended due to these concerns.
And there's a moral hazard issue, too.
A big one. The technological moral hazard is the risk that simply anticipating these large-scale tech fixes might reduce the pressure on us to actually cut emissions now. It becomes an excuse for delay, weakening collective resolve for the harder, necessary changes.
Okay, what about digital technology? That's often framed as inherently green efficiency, dematerialization.
Sanchez really challenges that green promise. While digital tools can certainly play a role in optimization, they have their own significant material, energy, and social realities that are often ignored.
Such as?
Well, the digital sector as a whole already accounts for around 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that figure is growing steadily. Think about energy-intensive data centers. Some are so power-hungry they're reactivating old gas or even coal plants to meet demand.
And artificial intelligence.
AI training, hugely energy-intensive. Training a model like GPT-3 used roughly 1.3 gigawatt hours of electricity. GPT-4 reportedly used nearly 10 times that. And cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in 2022 consumed more electricity than entire countries like Sweden.
We don't often think about that, or the devices themselves.
Right. The proliferation of Internet of Things devices, often with short lifespans, creates massive e-waste. And there are rebound effects here, too. Digital efficiency gains can sometimes intensify overall usage. Smart heating might save energy per household, but enable larger homes. Ride-sharing apps might replace walking or cycling.
And most impact assessments ignore the manufacturing and disposal.
Exactly. They focus on the use phase, ignoring the huge environmental footprint of making the devices, transporting them, and dealing with the waste. This sustains an illusion of digital neutrality or inherent greenness.
So this focus on technology can lead towards a kind of controlled or automated transition managed from the top down.
That's the risk Sanchez sees. Technological systems get adopted, often without broad public debate, framed purely in terms of efficiency metrics and technical roadmaps. It risks reducing the entire transition to a managerial process.
Like smart cities.
Yeah, he mentions examples like Songdo in South Korea or virtual Singapore, where essential city functions get outsourced to large tech consortia, potentially leaving citizens with very little democratic control or input. This technocratic framing prioritizes efficiency, often over social justice or adapting to diverse local needs.
So Sanchez calls for us to disengage the autopilot. What does that mean in practice?
It means challenging this logic of an automated tech-led transition, recognizing that digital tools, however sophisticated, cannot replace fundamental political debate about our goals, our values, what kind of society we want.
Innovation isn't enough on its own.
No, what's technically feasible isn't always socially desirable or ecologically sound. We need to create collective spaces, democratic spaces to debate, regulate, and consciously redirect technological choices.
Based on shared values, justice, local priorities.
Exactly. Placing local knowledge, citizen experimentation, democratic deliberation back at the heart of the transformation process.
Okay, so the core insight here is really important. While technology obviously has a role to play, relying on clean technologies as a simple alibi is dangerous.
It risks postponing deeper, necessary transformations, creating new inequalities, and obscuring significant environmental footprints we haven't accounted for.
So, a truly sustainable transition needs critical evaluation of tech, democratic governance over its deployment, and reframing technology as a tool that serves human defined goals, not something that dictates them.
That sums it up perfectly.
This leads us into a really profound, almost philosophical, but also deeply practical part of Sanchez's argument. He talks about the problem of modern societies governing without inhabiting, and the need to reconnect with the living world. It feels like we've built our world on this strict separation between humans and nature.
That's a very deep and accurate observation he makes. He points out that many pre-modern societies had a fundamentally different worldview. Think of concepts like Pachamama and the Andes life was understood as this interconnected web.
Where ecological balance wasn't separate from daily life, from rituals.
Exactly. It was woven into the fabric of society. But modernization, particularly Cartesian dualism, the split between mind and body, culture and nature, systematically marginalized these integrated worldviews. Nature became primarily a resource to be managed, exploited, controlled. A hierarchy of knowledge was imposed.
But we are seeing some shifts now, challenges to that separation.
Yes, definitely. The rise of frameworks like the Anthropocene, which highlights human impact on Earth systems, is one thing. And crucially, the growing legal recognition of nature's rights.
Like the Wanganui River in New Zealand or the Atrato River in Colombia?
Precisely. These are significant steps towards legitimizing alternative ways of knowing and relating to the non-human world. They challenge that historical tendency of turning life into stock.
What does he mean by turning life into stock?
It's about how modern societies largely built their relationship with nature by distancing themselves from it, defining humans as separate from an environment that's reduced to, well, a collection of objects to be exploited.
Driven by colonialism, the Industrial Revolution.
Those were key drivers, institutionalizing an extractive relationship. Nature was codified as property, rendered invisible in a way, even as its resources were mobilized on an unprecedented scale. And urbanization, agricultural mechanization, they created a sensory detachment.
How so?
Our basic conditions for life, food, water, shelter, become mediated by these opaque technical systems. We lose direct connection. Risk becomes a metric calculated by experts. Loss becomes a statistic in a report rather than a felt reality.
So ecology gets reduced to fit an extractive capitalist model.
That's the historical trajectory Sanchez traces. Nature framed as a reservoir of resources, integrated into a productivist logic, ecosystems reduced to their utilitarian function.
Going back to classical economics. Smith, Ricardo.
Yeah, where nature was seen as a largely free factor of production. Its value is primarily in its use, not its intrinsic existence. And modern legal systems largely reinforce this, classifying natural elements as property.
And this continues today with financialization.
Absolutely. Through things like valuing ecosystem services, carbon markets, biodiversity offsetting schemes. It's an attempt to manage nature by bringing it fully into the economic sphere, monetizing life itself, often disregarding its own complex logic and interdependencies.
And this detachment plays out in our cities too. Urbanism without anchoring.
Right. Industrial urbanization has profoundly altered our concrete, lived relationship with natural environments. Nature within cities is often reframed as just a design element, something to make things more efficient or pleasant, but still fundamentally separate, controlled.
Urban technologies filter out natural signals, leading to sensory impoverishment.
Yes. Think about air conditioning, removing temperature fluctuations, artificial light overriding natural cycles. Children growing up in very dense urban areas might primarily experience nature abstractly through screens or curated parks, losing that embodied connection.
So the call is to re-inhabit the living world. What does that mean in practice?
Sanchez argues it's a fundamental necessity, regrounding human practices in a sustainable relationship with the living world. It means inventing new ways of cohabiting that are rooted in specific places, attentive to non-human timescales and rhythms.
Like permaculture or farms, food forests.
Those are great examples. They aim to reconfigure aspects of modernity around interdependence and responsibility, not just extraction. It also requires a shift in narrative, as thinkers like Bruno Latour or Robin Wall Kimmerer advocate viewing nature not as out there, but as an expanded interior space we are part of.
And bringing sensory experience back into education.
Crucial. Reinserting sensory and aesthetic dimensions. And, as we mentioned, evolving legal frameworks like in Ecuador or New Zealand that recognize legal rights for natural entities, moving beyond seeing them purely as human property or resources.
Okay, so the key insight here is really profound. Breaking this historical trajectory of separation from nature isn't about being nostalgic or anti-modern.
No, it's presented as a collective political task for our time.
It requires rethinking how we inhabit places, how we produce things, how we represent the world, how we educate, aiming to restore human societies to their proper place within the ecological interdependencies that sustain all life.
Exactly, it's a call for a fundamental shift in relationship.
This idea of shifting our relationship, of restoring our place, leads naturally to another core challenge Sanchez raises: the need to rethink nature beyond just its utility to us. He argues our dominant approach is overwhelmingly utilitarian.
That's a really critical observation he makes. We tend to justify environmental protection primarily based on the services nature provides to humans: clean air, clean water, pollination, climate regulation.
Frameworks like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment or the concept of ecosystem services reinforce this.
They do. While valuable in some ways for raising awareness in economic and policy circles, this utilitarian logic has deep roots. It goes back to classical political economy, viewing nature as a free factor of production. Its value is in its use.
And this creates an implicit hierarchy.
Yes. It tends to prioritize landscapes or species that are obviously economically productive or provide easily quantifiable services. It can sideline environments that are harder to measure or don't have obvious human uses. Think of peatlands, native grasslands, less charismatic species. It obscures elements of the living world that resist being translated into use value.
So, Sanchez is arguing the living world isn't just a collection of indicators or resources for us.
Exactly. He proposes what can be called relational ecology as an alternative perspective. This affirms the inherent existence and value of natural entities, regardless of their immediate usefulness to humans.
Based on understanding complex interdependencies.
Right. Drawing on insights from anthropology, from decolonial studies,
Yeah.
thinkers like Philippe de Scola or Eduardo Cohn show how many non-Western cultures perceive natural entities, animals, plants, rivers, mountains, as persons, as subjects, as part of the same relational network as humans. This fosters coexistence built on reciprocity, not just utility.
And we're seeing practical examples of this: Ecuador's constitution,
Yeah.
the Wanganui River.
Those are powerful examples of this unconditional recognition gaining legal traction. Article 71 of Ecuador's 2008 Constitution grants intrinsic rights to nature, Pachamama. The Wanganui River in New Zealand having legal personhood, represented by a bicultural council. These establish really important precedents.
This leads to principles like listening, coexisting, cohabiting.
Yeah.
What does that involve?
It means true respect for nature requires acknowledging its own dynamics, its own long time frames, its own organizational principles, which often resist human standards of efficiency or control.
Like the Atrato River in Colombia.
Another key example. Granted legal personhood in 2016, it established a shared governance model rooted in ecological respect and the rights of local communities entwined with the river. It's also about preserving otherness, the parts of the living world that resist our attempts to fully understand or categorize them, and valuing ordinary biodiversity, the common species, the local ecosystems that underpin overall ecological balance, even if they aren't spectacular.
And recognizing interdependence.
Both biological and symbolic interdependence. And as Eleanor Ostrom's work on the commons demonstrated, community-based resource management, built on shared understanding and reciprocity, often yields more sustainable outcomes than purely private ownership or top-down state control.
So this is a call for rethinking to act differently, a fundamental shift.
It has to be. Challenging the purely utilitarian view means fundamentally revising how we make decisions, how we produce goods, how we regulate activities, how we educate, redefining the criteria for success.
Ethically, economically, legally, culturally.
All of those. Ethically, it brings in concepts like responsibility for future generations, the precautionary principle, acknowledging limits. Economically, it points towards moving beyond GDP growth as the primary measure. Think Bhutan's gross national happiness or Amsterdam's donut economics model. Legally, it's the growing recognition of natural elements as legal subjects, shifting legitimacy from utility to inherent existence. And culturally, it means changing our collective stories, making space for local knowledge, seasonal rhythms, think forest schools, community food forests.
So what does Sanchez argue nature asks of us, if not just to be useful?
He suggests recognizing nature beyond its use value isn't naive idealism, but actually a more realistic response to the demonstrated limits of purely utilitarian approaches. Compensation mechanisms, for instance, often fail because they try to substitute something irreplaceable, reproducing the extractive logic.
So it involves setting boundaries,
Yeah.
acknowledging non-substitutability.
Exactly. And developing robust tools and processes that can account for uncertainty, long timescales, and situated local knowledge blending scientific data with lived experience and ethical considerations.
Okay, the core insight here is profound. Moving beyond a purely utilitarian view of nature isn't just a philosophical shift, it's a methodological and political one.
Essential, Sanchez argues, for designing coherent responses to ecological complexity, for grounding our collective choices in responsibility, equity, and ultimately a transformation of our core values.
This brings us towards the end of Sanchez's critique, and towards his vision for a different path. He urges us towards an ecology of nuance, embracing complexity. He starts by pointing out the pitfalls of trying to standardize ecology.
Yes, this is a key practical point. We rely heavily on standardization tools, things like ISO environmental certifications, carbon footprint calculators, life cycle assessments. They're designed to help manage ecological dynamics, make them measurable.
But they oversimplify.
Inevitably, yes. They tend to obscure the unique specificities of different places, different ecosystems, long-term dynamics. This pushes environmental policies to conform to these technical formats.
With potentially negative consequences.
Right. Sometimes it favors practices like certain types of monoculture farming or forestry that perform well according to the standardized assessment metrics, but might offer uncertain or even negative real-world benefits in terms of biodiversity or resilience.
And funders prefer projects that fit these metrics.
Often, yes. Projects like large-scale tree plantations for carbon offsetting are easier to quantify and fund than, say, supporting integrated, small-scale agroecological systems, even if the latter are more resilient or socially just. And these tools are often designed in the global north.
Leading to a uniform approach.
A potential uniformization of problems and solutions, which limits the ability to develop truly adaptive policies suited to diverse local contexts.
So standardized transition models often fail because they ignore local context, soils, land use, social structures.
Exactly. You can't just impose a model developed elsewhere. It undermines effectiveness and misses the crucial lever of local anchoring. Sanchez cites examples like failed top-down water governance schemes in Burkina Faso versus successful collaborative fisheries management in Senegal's Saloum Delta, which was rooted in local institutions.
History matters too.
Hugely. He mentions Bolivia's indigenous governance systems resisting land grabs linked to carbon offset programs, drawing on long historical experience. And there's often a fundamental mismatch between the rapid timelines of politics and finance and the much slower rhythms of ecosystems, like wetland rehabilitation projects that need decades.
And Sanchez argues that diversity of practices, of approaches, is key to resilience.
Absolutely. Diversity is a foundational principle of both ecological and institutional resilience. It allows systems natural and social to absorb shocks, adapt to change.
Can you give examples?
Community forest management in Indonesia, which combines local knowledge with formal rules, combines centralized and decentralized energy models emerging in India, integration of scientific and indigenous knowledge for conservation in the Brazilian Amazon. Yet most environmental policies still rely on generalized standards that can sideline these vital alternative systems, like small-scale farms being excluded by certification schemes they can't meet.
So if reality is complex and diverse, we need flexible institutions.
Precisely. Institutions managing complex, unpredictable ecological systems need to move beyond rigid top-down frameworks. They need to embrace adaptability, ongoing revision, learning from experience.
He calls this adaptive governance.
Yes, drawing on work by scholars like Paul Wolstall, Ostrom, and others. It involves flexible rules, openness to diverse forms of knowledge, not just expert science, participatory decision-making, and mechanisms for continuous monitoring and revision.
Are there real-world examples?
The Netherlands' Room for the River program is a classic example, adapting flood management based on local conditions and ongoing learning. Or Colombian watershed governance platforms that bring diverse stakeholders together. Flexibility here isn't about a lack of authority. It's a pragmatic acknowledgement of complexity, prioritizing listening and experimentation over prediction and control.
And this extends to creating non-hierarchical environmental policies, not just top-down prescriptions.
Right. Prescriptive policies, like outright fuel bans or uniform agricultural standards, often have counterproductive social or economic effects, especially if imposed without consultation or attention to justice. Think of Australia's carbon tax repeal after public backlash.
So we need to accept uncertainty as part of the deal.
Accept it as a structural component. Environmental decisions almost always involve value judgments, trade-offs between competing goals. Sanchez advocates for adaptive, non-prescriptive frameworks, things like Spain's Comunidades Energéticas Locales, local energy communities, or Canada's First Nations-led restoration programs. These build on support structures, shared goals, and local initiative, leading to greater political stability and buy-in.
Okay, the core insight here is about embracing nuance. True sustainability and resilience require moving beyond standardization and conformity.
Yes, an ecology of nuance. It demands policies that are sensitive to context, that embrace diversity in solutions, that allow for adaptation and learning over time.
And recognize that real effectiveness comes from robust, flexible institutions that are open to learning, feedback, and ongoing adjustment in the face of complexity.
Exactly. It's a very different model from top-down prediction and control.
So, given all this emphasis on complexity, nuance, and local context, where do we find practical pathways forward? Sanchez dedicates his final sections to highlighting existing examples of local resilience.
This is where his analysis becomes really grounded and, frankly, quite hopeful. He looks at alternatives that are already working, often at the margins of dominant systems. Farming is a key area,
Moving beyond industrial agriculture.
definitely. Contrasting mainstream agriculture's contribution to soil degradation, water pollution, and biodiversity loss with alternative models rooted in ecological regeneration and local autonomy. Agroecology is a central concept here.
What does that involve?
It's a systemic approach, weaving together ecological principles with social, economic, and territorial dimensions. He gives examples from Latin America, like the MST landless workers movement in Brazil, developing sustainable farming systems, to cooperative dairy projects in France, or integrated production methods supported by research institutes in Switzerland.
Are there challenges?
Of course, he mentions the economic vulnerability of, say, Swiss producers facing strict regulations and market pressures. But he also highlights the potential of small-scale permaculture, like the Bec-Hello wind farm in France, which achieved remarkable productivity on a small area, and land restoration techniques drawing on local traditional knowledge, like the zai pints used to restore degraded land in Burkina Faso or Japan's Sadayama landscapes. Even large cooperatives like Organic Valley in the U.S. show sustainability can work at scale.
Okay, so farming is one pathway. What about energy?
Decentralized energy systems. He critiques the limitations of the old 20th century model, large power plants, long transmission lines, which struggles to integrate intermittent renewables efficiently and is vulnerable to large-scale failures.
So the alternative is more local, distributed.
Yes. Approaches that draw on local resources, sun, wind, biomass, geothermal use, distributed production, closer to where energy is needed, and often involve shared governance models like cooperatives.
Are there compelling examples?
He mentions Feldheim in Germany, a village that achieved complete energy self-sufficiency using wind, solar, and biomass with local ownership. Hybrid mini-grids bringing power to rural communities in East Africa, Swiss energy cooperatives experimenting with neighborhood-level self-consumption, and smart grids. Even as Switzerland faces challenges phasing out nuclear power, these decentralized systems offer potential for both supply security and a smoother transition.
And how do cities fit into this picture of local resilience?
Sanchez is a bit skeptical of some large-scale, top-down sustainable urbanism projects, arguing they're often expensive, inflexible, and poorly adapted to local needs. He favors more modest, maybe more adaptable initiatives driven by local governments or citizen cooperatives.
Like what?
Examples from Switzerland include Geneva's Junction neighborhood, focusing on circular economy principles, or Zurich's Kalkbreit cooperative offering car-free participatory housing. Freiburg's Vauban neighborhood in Germany is famous for its iterative, resident-led planning process. In North America, Portland's Eco Districts program focuses on gradual neighborhood transformations through energy retrofits, green infrastructure, and urban agriculture.
He calls this everyday ecology.
Yes, small in scale individually perhaps, but potentially transformative collectively, rich in collective intelligence, shaping more durable, livable urban development from the ground up.
This sounds very much like Eleanor Ostrom's work on the commons again. Rules shaped for people.
You've hit on a key theme. Sanchez highlights how alternative forms of organization are emerging, often from the margins, based on rules designed by and for the people involved, rooted in concrete practices and local capacities. Ostrom's research showed how communities can successfully manage shared resources, forests, fisheries, irrigation systems, seeds through collectively defined rights and self-organization, avoiding the tragedy of the commons.
And we see this applied today.
Absolutely. Community-based natural resource management is widespread in countries like India, Nepal, Mexico, urban digital commons initiatives in Barcelona, food cooperatives like La Brouette in Lausanne, Switzerland, farmer seed networks preserving agricultural biodiversity in Ecuador and France. These are all examples of commons-based approaches.
So it's about resisting through practice, using situated knowledge.
Exactly. Innovation often bubbles up outside formal R&D labs or government programs. It's driven by local actors, using situated knowledge, the practical wisdom gained from experience in a specific place. Think of traditional underground irrigation systems in the Maghreb, France's low-tech lab promoting simple, robust technologies, or farmers adapting techniques for manual agriculture in steep alpine terrain.
These practices might be invisible in official reports.
Often, yes, because they're small-scale, informal, hard to quantify using standard metrics. But Sanchez argues they are silently reshaping ways of living, producing, and cooperating. Acknowledging their significance requires rethinking our evaluation criteria, giving genuine status to these local forms of intelligence. It reveals that in many ways the transition is already underway, just perhaps not in the places mainstream narratives focus on.
Okay, so the final key insight is that these alternatives aren't just marginal experiments. They are embedded, structured practices.
Often carefully evaluated and designed for specific contexts. Their strength lies in their adaptability, their blending of local and technical knowledge, their distributed decision-making. They offer operational resilience.
And the future of ecological policy depends on recognizing and supporting this diversity, these context-specific models.
That seems to be Sanchez's core message for a viable pathway forward.
So in this final segment, Sanchez really brings it all together with a powerful call. Refuse haste, embrace the long term. He argues that our obsession with speed in the climate space can actually be a trap.
It's a really counterintuitive but crucial message in today's climate discourse. Speed has become almost a dogma in transition policies, right? It's seen as a sign of commitment, of efficiency. Get things done quickly.
But ecosystems don't work on our timelines.
Not at all. Ecosystems operate on much slower, often nonlinear schedules. Ecological regeneration, soil building, forest recovery. These things take time, sometimes generations. Sanchez argues that trying to accelerate processes artificially can produce counterproductive effects.
Like displacing environmental impacts elsewhere through hasty outsourcing, or implementing solutions before we understand the side effects.
Exactly. And time pressure also tends to standardize pathways. We grab the off-the-shelf solution because it's quickest, rather than developing a locally adapted one. This limits adaptation, it weakens local legitimacy, and it can provoke resistance. Thinkers like Hartmut Rosa have written about the problems of social acceleration more broadly.
So we need to weave together different timescales, ecological, social, technical.
Precisely. Recognize they don't all move at the same pace.
This sounds like it requires a very different mindset. What he calls critical thinking against locked-in consensus, challenging the idea that we must suppress doubt.
Yes. Doubt is often framed as weakness, as obstructionism, especially when faced with an emergency. But Sanchez, drawing on ideas like post-normal science from Fontovitz and Rivets, argues that uncertainty isn't a failure of knowledge in complex systems, it's an inherent property.
Especially when the stakes are high and values conflict.
Exactly. In those situations where facts are uncertain, values are in dispute, stakes are high, decisions are urgent, that's post-normal science, public deliberation acknowledging uncertainty openly becomes essential, not optional. Trying to eliminate uncertainty prematurely can actually amplify instability down the line, as Ulrich Beck also argued.
So robust policy embraces uncertainty, admits reversibility, fosters learning.
Yes. It incorporates diverse knowledge sources, not just expert models. It builds in flexibility and feedback loops. Sanchez highlights the value of things like adversarial review mechanisms, where critiques are actively sought out and engaged with. It's about reclaiming doubt as an intellectual necessity to preserve our ability to adapt.
And this connects to understanding the temporalities of living environments, taking the time to observe.
Crucial. Environmental policy, Sanchez stresses, can only be effective if it takes the time to understand the specific ecosystems it's intervening in. This requires sustained, attentive observation, often over long periods. Quick assessments can miss vital dynamics.
He gives examples of rapid interventions failing.
Yeah, like river restoration projects that fail because they don't fully grasp the river's long-term hydrology or ecological rhythms. He argues that slowness, in this context, isn't inaction. It's a posture of attention, a method of gradual adjustment based on feedback.
Allowing us to detect subtle changes, align actions with social rhythms too.
Exactly. Supported, perhaps, by things like long-term territorial observatories that track changes over time.
And Sanchez flips the script on disagreement, too. He says we should sustain disagreement, not avoid it.
Right. Controversy is usually seen as an obstacle to action. But drawing on science and technology studies, he argues that controversy, when managed constructively, is actually productive.
How so?
It helps make underlying assumptions explicit. It clarifies the margins for negotiation. It forces different viewpoints and potential alternatives into the open. He contrasts the long, bitter conflict over Brazil's Belo Monte Dam, marked by a lack of consultation, with processes like France's National Commission for Public Debate, CNDP, or consultations around Quebec's hydro projects, which, while still conflictual, aim to incorporate local concerns more systematically.
So documenting disagreements, making friction visible, actually improves decisions.
It can make them more resilient and deepens everyone's understanding of why certain options face support or rejection.
Finally, he talks about the rhythms of transition needing to consider social and cultural timeframes.
This is absolute key for implementation. Ecological transitions don't happen in a vacuum. They have to mesh with social, cultural, and institutional rhythms. Effectiveness depends on this compatibility.
Ignoring these rhythms leads to rejection, fatigue.
Often, yes. Think about ambitious energy retrofit programs or urban mobility plans that get imposed too quickly, without adequate support or time for people to adapt their lives and habits.
He uses the EU's 2035 ban on new combustion engine cars as an example.
As a potential example of this tension, the institutional deadline is clear, but its alignment with the real-world temporalities of building charging infrastructure, ensuring grid capacity, addressing the social impact on low-income households reliant on older cars, that's much less certain. The policy's success hinges on navigating these conflicting rhythms.
Okay, so the final core insight is powerful. A truly transformative and sustainable transition demands that we refuse the tyranny of haste.
Yes, embrace the long term, value gradual adjustments based on learning, embrace uncertainty and constructive debate.
And align policies with the diverse, often slower rhythms of both living systems and social realities. It's a call for patience and wisdom alongside action,
A fundamentally different approach to governing change.
which leads directly to his final proposals for reframing environmental governance itself. If we move away from haste and symbol targets, what replaces them? Sanchez argues against relying solely on fixed, goal-based regulation.
Right, especially in complex ecological systems. Meeting a single numerical target, say, for emissions or biodiversity, doesn't automatically guarantee overall system resilience or prevent unintended negative consequences elsewhere.
So what's the alternative?
He proposes shifting towards more process-based regulation. This approach values things like adaptability, transparency in decision-making, and mechanisms for ongoing evaluation and adjustment. It recognizes uncertainty not as a problem to be eliminated, but as a structural feature of the systems we're trying to influence.
Can you give examples?
Things like local water management committees in France, which involve diverse stakeholders in ongoing deliberation and planning, or environmental audits used by cantons like Basel City in Switzerland. These approaches redefine public responsibility. It's less about hitting a fixed target and more about explaining choices, monitoring outcomes, and responding effectively to unforeseen developments. They build trust through process.
And this also requires flexible institutions and autonomous territories, less centralization.
Absolutely. Centralized one-size-fits-all frameworks struggle to cope with ecological diversity and local social dynamics. And ironically, calls for emergency action often reinforce those centralizing reflexes, which can lead to inefficiency and local resistance.
So the most robust governance allows for experimentation, local variation.
Yes, Sanchez argues for governance structures that provide a framework, a shared normative foundation, but allow for significant local experimentation and adjustment. Drawing on thinkers like Lascaux and Legalès, he emphasizes shared governance models.
Like Bologna's co-determination of public space, or Naples managing water as a common good.
Exactly. These examples show territories becoming sites of institutional intelligence, developing solutions truly rooted in local realities and capacities, rather than just implementing top-down mandates.
And making good decisions requires seeing clearly. Transparency, traceability, plurality of expertise.
These are crucial pillars for legitimate governance. Transparency means clearly stating the assumptions behind policies, the trade-offs being made, the knowledge sources being prioritized, and doing so in accessible language.
Traceability adds a time dimension.
Yes, it allows policies and decisions to be understood in their historical context, remaining open to reinterpretation and revision as conditions or knowledge change. And plurality of expertise is vital, moving beyond just technical or economic experts to include practical, situated, local, and indigenous knowledge holders broadens the perspective immensely.
This all sounds like it requires a fundamental shift in how we educate people, especially professionals and policymakers. Educating for complexity, training for uncertainty.
Definitely. The ecological transition requires transforming our underlying cognitive frameworks, moving beyond linear cause and effect thinking, beyond simplified explanatory models, towards embracing complexity and ambiguity.
So educating for sustainability needs to be transformative.
Yes. Fostering critical inquiry, systems thinking, recognizing knowledge plurality. Sanchez suggests pedagogical approaches, like using contrasting future scenarios, participatory modeling where stakeholders build models together, and analyzing real-world controversies to understand different perspectives. These methods help equip practitioners to navigate, rather than just avoid, high uncertainty, high-stakes environments.
And finally, Sanchez makes a strong plea for realistic policies for sustainable transitions, avoiding overpromising.
Yes, he critiques the tendency towards overambitious political commitments that often exceed actual institutional capacities or societal readiness.
Yeah.
This can lead to implementation gaps and an erosion of political credibility over time.
So institutional realism.
It means recognizing constraints, financial, political, administrative, social, and prioritizing the development of robust mechanisms for gradual adaptation and learning, rather than just setting distant, lofty goals. It involves differentiated roles for various levels of public action: national, regional, local.
He mentions lean configurations.
Yeah, policies or programs grounded in existing capabilities and local skills. He gives examples like Portland, Oregon's gradual, sector-by-sector emission reduction strategy, or Rosario, Argentina's successful urban agriculture program, which built on existing community networks and skills. These are often more politically stable and achieve more lasting change.
Okay, so the final core insight on governance is about a shift in approach, moving towards process-based regulation, flexible and autonomous institutions.
Ensuring transparency and plural expertise, educating for complexity, and crafting realistic policies grounded in capabilities.
All of this fosters endurance, operational diversity, and actually strengthens climate action by embracing doubt and complexity as foundations for navigating a fundamentally unstable and unpredictable world.
It's a call for a more humble, yet ultimately more robust, form of governance.
Wow, what an incredible and incredibly challenging deep dive. Raul Sanchez's The Climate Panic really does force you to rethink so much about the dominant climate narrative.
It absolutely does. It pushes back against that sense of urgency and simplification, urging us towards nuance, complexity, and crucially, a more just and participatory approach to environmental action.
So let's recap some key takeaways. For me, a big one was understanding the climate emergency not just as a fact, but as a narrative, one that, while well-intentioned, can inadvertently overlook complexity and have real human psychological impacts.
Definitely. And linked to that, the importance of addressing that psychological toll, the eco-anxiety, the overload, and resisting those purely guilt-inducing messages that can paralyze rather than empower.
And I was really struck by the argument for responsible pluralism, the critical need for open, reasoned debate, even disagreement, over a kind of silencing consensus if we want robust solutions.
Absolutely. Plus, the absolute necessity of tackling the profound social and territorial inequalities that are so often baked into the energy transition, making sure it's genuinely fair, not just green for some.
We also need that structural vigilance, right? To counter greenwashing, yes, but also to acknowledge the complex economic and political interests driving climate finance and policy.
Taking a much more critical look at technological solutions, moving beyond seeing technology as a simple alibi that lets us avoid deeper changes in lifestyles and economic structures.
The call to re-inhabit the living world really resonated, moving beyond seeing nature purely through a utilitarian lens, recognizing its inherent value, restoring that connection.
Which connects directly to recognizing the power of local resilience, of situated knowledge, of those diverse, adaptive, often slower approaches that are already happening on the ground.
And finally, that profound wisdom in refusing haste, embracing the long-term rhythms of ecological and social systems, and designing governance that is flexible, transparent, realistic, and educates for uncertainty instead of pretending we have all the answers.
It's a call for a fundamentally different quality of attention and action.
So as you go about your day, maybe take a moment to consider what shifts in your own thinking, or perhaps even your daily life, might emerge from this deeper understanding of climate narratives.
What would it mean for you to actively cultivate an ecology of nuance in your own conversations, your own choices, moving beyond that simple binary of panic on one side or denial on the other?
How can you, in your own sphere, contribute to a transition that prioritizes justice, participation, and long-term resilience over just speed and top-down imposed solutions?
This deep dive, as always, is just a starting point for that kind of reflection and exploration.
We strongly encourage you to seek out the book The Climate Panic by Raoul Sanchez if this discussion piqued your interest, and to explore the many diverse perspectives we touched on today. Until next time, keep diving deep.